Right. Hello. Because we're not taking action today, we are receiving and filing a presentation. We don't yet have quorum. I'm confident that we will have quorum, but because we're not taking action, I'm going to go ahead and have us get started with the presentation. And look at that, quorum. My name is Jeremiah Ellison. I am the chair for the Elections and Rules Committee, and I am joined today at the dais by Councilmembers Reich, Fletcher, Warsame, Jenkins, Schrader, and Johnson, and we are a quorum of the committee. Today we have one item on the agenda, and that is to receive and file a report on the plans and preparations for the Elections and Voter Services Division related to the 2020 presidential nomination primary. Here to give the presentation is City Clerk Casey Carl, and Mr. Carl, I will let you take it away.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. As stated, my name is Casey Carl. I have the privilege of serving as City Clerk for the City of Minneapolis, which means I am also the city's chief elections official, and I'm here before you this morning in that capacity to report on initial plans and preparations for the 2020 presidential election cycle, which I should point out begins 58 days from today, when early voting period for the presidential nomination primary opens. Today's report updates and adds more detail to the first report that staff presented to this committee at its meeting on March 27th. Before I dive into plans for the presidential election cycle, it's important to pause to celebrate a major milestone in the life of the Elections and Voter Services Division, and that is the opening of our new headquarters facility, a space that unites all programs under a single roof. This has been a strategic goal for the division since before I joined the city in 2010. We were extremely happy to get this new space that will allow us to improve our internal operations, realize some new efficiencies, enhance voter service, and more. The new facility is located at 980 East Hennepin Avenue, which is in Ward 2. Relocating to this new facility in 2019 was ideal for the division since there were no regular elections programmed this year of the four-year cycle. And as a result, the team was able to thoughtfully collaborate with property services on the layout, design, and the planned functionality of the space. Equally as important, this facility was designed to be an asset to the larger city enterprise when we aren't actively engaged in conducting elections. So the early voting center component of the facility, the training room, the conference rooms, all of these spaces can, and we expect will, be made available for use by other city departments. The site is situated on several public transit routes. We've installed bike racks in front of the building, and we have ample free parking for voters. An open house to commemorate the new facility was conducted October 4th and 5th in conjunction with an exhibit by the League of Women Voters that celebrated passage of the 100th anniversary of passage in 1920 of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. We were very pleased to welcome Secretary of State Steve Simon and his State Elections Director David Maeda, as well as Mayor Fry, Council President Bender, and Vice President Jenkins, Elections Chair Ellison, and Council Members Reich, Gordon, and Fletcher to the open house to help us cut the ceremonial red, white, and blue ribbon to mark the occasion. This slide lists the key dates and timelines for the 2020 presidential election cycle. As previously noted, early voting for the presidential nomination primary gets started on Friday, January 17th, continues for 46 days until the actual election on Super Tuesday, which is March 3rd. The presidential primary replaces the long-standing caucus tradition, but only for the race for president. Caucuses will still be conducted on February 25th, 1 week prior to the presidential primary for other party business. And then, of course, we'll have the statewide primary on August 11th, followed by the big show, which is the presidential general election on Tuesday, November 3rd. As we've been planning for the 2020 presidential election, staff has reflected on the steady increasing turnout Minneapolis has experienced over the past 2 decades. The city's average turnout for presidential elections between 1998 and 2016 was roughly 71.8%. That compares to a national average voter turnout for presidential elections of approximately 53.6%. So that's a 29-point difference between what we've achieved here in the city for presidential turnouts as compared to the average across the nation in all presidential elections between 1988 and 2016. Minneapolitans vote, and that contributes significantly to the reputation the state of Minnesota enjoys as the state with some of the most consistent, highest levels of voter engagement and participation in the nation. We're also keenly aware of media coverage, analyses by political experts, and predictions by political scientists, which have dominated headlines this entire year. So some of these headlines that are showing on the slide now reflect the 2020 presidential election is widely anticipated to have the potential to be the highest turnout in at least a century, bringing with it the potential to reshape the composition of the nation's electorate in a significant way. Michael McDonald, a leading political scientist, elections and voting behavior expert, and a professor at the University of Florida, has urged election administrators to expect what he has called a voter turnout storm of the century in 2020. Professor McDonald has indicated that his predictive models estimate that as many as 2/3 of all eligible American voters could cast ballots next year. If true, that would represent the highest presidential election turnout since 1908, when 65.7% of all eligible American voters cast ballots. And remember, that was before the right to vote was extended to women, and the voting age right was lowered to 18 in 1972. Since 1908, the highest turnout for a presidential election was in 2008, when 61.6% of eligible voters cast ballots, and Barack Obama was elected to his first term as President of the United States. Experts on both sides of the political aisle agree on the potential for record-setting turnout, which is in part predicated on the record-setting turnout that we did experience in 2018. The 2018 midterm had 120 million ballots cast, and voter participation that year was the highest for a midterm election since 1914. So these analyses, these predictions, and voter turnout forecasts all seem to be pointing to the same potential conclusion. Specifically, the greatest number of American voters going to the polls in several decades at least, and possibly in the past century, if not the nation's history. Time will tell. But regardless, the city's elections and voter services team must be prepared to serve each voter who chooses to participate. And that means that each voter receives the same consistent high standard of service for the presidential primary, for the statewide primary in August, and for the general election in November, and whether they're casting their ballots early, in person, by mail, or at the polls on election day. As our election judge credo states, we will do everything within the law to help each eligible voter cast the ballot. This slide shows the big planning buckets that we've established. Specifically, we are developing and finalizing plans tied to voter registration and get out the vote initiatives, ballot access, and employment. In each of these big buckets, we are building strategies to reach hard-to-reach, underrepresented communities to ensure that all voters who choose to engage are election ready, and to use seasonal employment opportunities to help diversify our workforce so that our precincts reflect the various communities that we serve. As previously noted, next year's presidential primary is the first time Minnesota has conducted a primary like that since 1992. In the state's history, we have only conducted presidential primaries 4 other times: in 1916, in 1952, in 1956, and then in 1992. So this will be our 5th experiment with a presidential primary. And as I've already stated, the political environment is much changed. In 1992, there was minimal interest in the presidential primary, resulting in a voter turnout of just 15.7%. That's roughly equal to the average nationwide turnout we would expect for a municipal-only election. Again, happily, Minneapolis has higher turnout for its municipal elections. In fact, we achieved more than 42% turnout in our last municipal election in 2017, more than double the turnout that was achieved in the 1992 presidential primary. Even then, however, turnout patterns were about the same as they are today. Specifically, highest turnout was in Ward 3, lowest turnout was in Ward 5 during the 1992 presidential primary. So, looking to the past, in this case, is not very useful for us as we prepare for the 2020 presidential nomination primary. As council is aware, the state legislature did allocate funding to help offset costs of the presidential primary through a reimbursement program for certain eligible expenses. Some of those eligible expenses would include costs tied to preparation and printing of ballots, postage associated with vote-by-mail absentee balloting, the publication of sample ballots, the preparation of polling places in an amount not to exceed $150 per polling place, the preparation of electronic voting systems not to exceed $100 per precinct, and the salaries for election judges, among others. The city's elections team has collaborated with the Secretary of State's office in developing and refining various expenditure models in order to get a good sample of how large the statewide budgetary impact could be. Our estimates show that the presidential primary could cost the city of Minneapolis up to $1.6 million. While that amount can sound shocking, in context, that's roughly the amount that the city would pay anyways for a primary election in a normal election year. So we're essentially adding 2 primaries to 2020. The difficulty is that this is added to the existing statewide primary and the existing general election in 2020, so it does create a sharp spike in the proposed 2020 budget for elections and voter services. And I'll address some of those budget details a little bit later. As you can see on this slide, the Elections and Voter Services Division is forecasting the potential for turnout of approximately 42,000 voters for the presidential primary. And as you can see from the chart that's on this slide, that number would put turnout roughly between what was actually achieved for the last presidential general election in 2016 and the turnout for the 2018 midterm election. This may be admittedly a little bit on the higher side, but again, we're hedging our bets by preparing for a high turnout, which helps ensure that we minimize any surprises or system breakdowns on election day, something we all want to avoid. As we discussed during the March report, we are actively pursuing a number of community-based partnerships to help ensure that all eligible voters are election ready. This slide shows some of the plans that are being developed. There are also more details in the printed report shown on pages 6, 7, and 8. With respect to core messages, specifically those that are tied to the presidential primary, we want to be sure that all voters understand the different set of rules that apply to that one event, especially before voters show up to vote, whether in person, early, by mail, or at the polls on March 3rd. Again, because the presidential primary is a partisan function, one that previously had been conducted by the parties themselves, the presidential primary includes some small but very important differences from the usual experiences voters are used to having in the polls. First, voters will be asked to identify which of the 4 major political party ballots they wish to be issued, and this information will be captured by the poll workers. They will also be asked to sign a statement indicating that they agree to the principles of that political party. A ballot cannot and will not be issued unless a voter makes a political selection of ballot reflecting that party preference. As this council knows, there was a major concern that this data, if collected by local government, would be classified public data and would therefore be subject to release as required under the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act. The Secretary of State was successful at pushing an amendment through which classifies this required political data on individuals outside the public realm. So that data will be classified as not public. However, it will be shared with the major political parties, and there's nothing that would prevent those political parties from making that data public. Thus, our messaging around the presidential primary focuses on these unique factors in addition to the usual messages about the 3 ways to cast a ballot. We've already launched a series of neighborhood tours where we are taking information about the upcoming 2020 census, the presidential primary, and the presidential election cycle to our neighborhood organizations as a means of engaging them as partners in ensuring that all residents are counted in the census and that all eligible voters who choose to participate in the primary or the general election are able to do so. As in prior years, a key strategy to avoid long lines and to reduce wait times at the polls is to promote early voting as a means of voter convenience and enhanced access to the ballot box. Here again, we are working with community-based partners to promote awareness of early voting in all of its various forms, including in-person early voting and voting by mail as the 2 most prevalent forms. Additional details about our plans tied to early voting are found on pages 10, 11, and 12 of your report. This slide shows the growing popularity of absentee balloting. Absentee balloting is the umbrella term for voting before Election Day. So as you can see, particularly since 2014, Minneapolis has experienced a significant increase in turnout through early voting, particularly in conjunction with the general elections in each even-numbered year. You'll recall that the state enacted no-excuse absentee balloting in 2014, which marks the beginning of this trend. Then, in 2016, the state enacted direct balloting, which occurs during the final 7 days of absentee balloting and gives in-person early voters the exact same experience, protections, and support that all voters receive in the polls on Election Day. Direct balloting is distinguished by the fact that voters get to put their completed absentee ballot directly into the tabulator rather than wrapped up in a series of privacy envelopes to be kept safe until they can be opened and tabulated later. In preparation for next year's 3 planned election events, we've also added 2 new precincts and made changes in the location of 3 polling places. Those additions and changes are shown on this slide. As you can see, we've added a new precinct in Ward 3 and a new precinct in Ward 10. The 2 new precincts means that Minneapolis now has a total of 134 separate precincts spread across all 13 wards. As the largest city in the state, it isn't surprising that Minneapolis has the most precincts to serve its voter base. But to put that in context, it's interesting to note that the city of Bloomington has a total of 32 precincts. So within Hennepin County, we have 134. The next city in terms of precinct size is Bloomington. They have 32. So Minneapolis has 134, Bloomington has 32. And again, this illustrates the fact that Minneapolis, in terms of its elections operations, is much more aligned with and comparable to counties in Minnesota, not other cities. Our population, our diverse demographics, and our active and very highly engaged communities make Minneapolis unique among other local jurisdictions across the state when it comes to planning, organizing, engaging, and conducting elections. You've seen this chart many times before. However, it does tell an important story about our work to serve voters. Specifically, this graph tracks the growth in the city's population since 1990 compared to the number of precincts that have been created to serve voters. So going into 2020, we have a total of 134 precincts, as I said, to serve a population that's been estimated at more than 420,000. By comparison, in 1994, the city had a total of 172 precincts to serve a much lower population, approximately 362,000. In short, Minneapolis has grown by almost 58,000 residents, and we've lost 38 precincts. As I've said before in reports from previous election years, this fact can be expected to create the high potential for long lines, extended wait times, and voter frustration at the polls on election day. That is particularly true in a high turnout presidential election. Given current statistics, the city of Minneapolis has an average registered voter count of roughly 1,864 voters per precinct. But of course, that's not equally balanced across all precincts. This slide builds on that concept of the number of registered voters per precinct, but uses actual data to show how that distribution of voters is done. Despite our efforts to better balance the voter to precinct ratio, this chart shows that the city still has 25 precincts that have more than 2,500 registered voters. That exceeds the recommended limits established by the Secretary of State's office. In fact, we have 4 precincts that have more than 3,000 registered voters.
Excuse me, Clerk?
Yes.
We've got a question. First I want to note that we've been joined by Councilmembers Goodman and Gordon, and then we have a question from Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Carl, do you have an analysis, however, of those precincts, how many people vote in advance? Like, for example, I know in my ward, 7-8 is a very large precinct. There's also a massive group of seniors who early vote and don't go down to the precinct. So do you have a breakdown of those 25 and the past years of easy absentee balloting and how many do that versus not?
Through the chair, Councilmember Goodman, I don't have it with me today. We do track that information. At a high level, I would say absentee balloting or early balloting, whether by mail or in person, still only accounts in total for approximately or about 20%. So even where we have large precincts, there's still the majority impact on election day. That's one of the reasons that we're really working over the last few years and certainly going into 2020 to promote early voting. We're promoting vote by mail. We're promoting vote early in person in order to offset the potential impact on election day at the polls. The other piece that this data doesn't track is the number of potential people registering at the polls on election day. So Minnesota, of course, has same-day registration, and that is a benefit, a boon to voters, but we aren't even counting those voters here. These are registered voters that we know of. People could have moved to Minneapolis not registered, and then that would also impact the potential lines and wait times at those precincts.
Mr. Chair, I would love to see for my ward the outliers. I'm sure everyone would, but I'll just speak for myself that I know of one, but I don't know there could be others. I would love to see the outlier as well as how many people voted in advance in the 18 election and how many people registered on the same day. And for the most part, there's about the same number of housing units. So there's not great fluctuations in that. So I'm just interested in seeing that just because I know it's in 7-8 in my ward.
Happy to get that to the council.
And were there any other questions before we? All right, continue.
So at any rate, and the fact of these high percentage absentee participation since 1998 was in the 2016 presidential election. In that year, the absentee voting accounted for 27.5% of all ballots cast. So even then, almost 72% of our voters actually preferred to cast their ballots at the polls on election day. So to that specific point that was just discussed, 72% of voters turn up on election day at the polls, no matter how much we promote early voting. So precinct sizing and an equalized distribution of registered voters to the number of precincts is a critical factor that can have a significant impact on our ability to successfully conduct an election. A full listing of all of the precincts and the associated polling places for the city going into 2020 is shown in the report on pages 18 and 19. As the council is aware, we've begun to recruit and hire our seasonal staff to ensure our readiness to conduct the 2020 presidential primary. As this chart shows, we anticipate hiring a seasonal crew of about 59 people. This slide shows how those staffers will be allocated amongst the division's various programs. You'll note that the majority of seasonal workers will be allocated to the absentee balloting program, split between vote by mail and early in person. This slide also gives a summary of some of the work that these seasonal workers perform, from recruiting, training, scheduling, and paying our core of nearly 2,500 election judges, to providing service at the front counter, planning outreach initiatives, and helping with the myriad of detailed work that goes into ordering, organizing, and deploying our supplies, equipment, and materials to all 143 precincts. We simply could not pull together all of the strings that are involved in planning and conducting the election without that amazing seasonal team. And we are truly blessed to have seasonal staffers who are very experienced that return year after year to take on these positions. Some of the more seasoned workers are also assigned as supervisors and help to plan, organize, and assign work to their groups and teams centered around those core functions. And of course, we're deeply engaged in finalizing next year's training plans and schedules so that we can provide the state mandated judge training, as well as the additional trainings that are exclusively developed for the Minneapolis Corps of Election Judges and encompasses all 2,500 judges we expect to deploy over the course of the 3 events next year. Details about election judges, including our nationally award-winning student judge program and our seasonal staffers, are provided in the report on pages 14 and 15. I added this slide because it resonates with the core of everything that we do in elections and voter services, and specifically, we prepare an incredible workforce to serve one of the most engaged communities in the nation, approaching each voter with the credo, as I said before, I'll do all I can within the law to help you vote today. Our election judges are on the front line of democracy. So the next series of slides provides details about the division's budget, and more particularly what Mayor Frey has recommended for the 2020 presidential election cycle and how we anticipate spending those funds for the 3 regular election events next year. At a macro level, you can see that the elections budget is divided into 2 separate but interrelated buckets or categories. First, there's the core budget, which covers the day-to-day, year-to-year costs of the division, including its permanent staff and the hard costs of the division's operations. Then second, there is the 2020 election budget, which is specifically developed to cover the costs that are projected to be required to administer the elections next year. So the core budget is about $2.3 million. It's perhaps easy to think of this as the division's base budget. Costs for the specific election each year are budgeted and tracked separately so that we can do comparative analyses between election years and between election types. Most jurisdictions budget for elections in a very similar manner because of the volatility of funding elections. The 2020 election budget covers costs planned in each of the division's major programs that are shown on this slide. In total, then, the proposed 2020 elections budget is $6.4 million. Of that total, 4.1 is really targeted at funding the 3 election events planned for 2020. For comparative purposes, the city actually spent $4.3 million for the 2016 presidential election, which had only 2 events and didn't include a separate presidential primary. It was not also the highest turnout on record for a presidential election. So this budget is actually in line with the expenditures of prior years. This chart on this slide shows that we break down expenditures in each of the division's major programs into 2 buckets, staffing and supplies. Of the 2, staffing is clearly the biggest budgetary impact, as might be expected. In fact, the fiscal impact of the staffing portion of the budget equates to about 85% of the total election budget. An even more detailed breakdown of the total 2020 elections budget is shown on page 21 of your report. This chart on the slide, however, just summarizes that larger table. Still, you can see that the elections team has estimated it will spend approximately 24% of the total election budget for the presidential primary, with 32% being reserved for the anticipated high turnout general election in November. Of course, any funds that are saved on the presidential primary or on the statewide primary would carry forward and be applied to the general election if and as necessary. In short, the Elections and Voter Services Division estimates that the cost of conducting the presidential nomination primary will be approximately $1.6 million, as I said earlier, some of which will be reimbursed by the state, as explained earlier. We would anticipate spending about $1.4 million for the regular statewide primary in August, consistent with similar primaries in other election years. And finally, we anticipate the costs for the general election in November will come in at roughly $2.2 million. There are many factors that contribute to those costs. However, two of the biggest are wages and absentee balloting, which I'll cover in the next few slides. As I already mentioned, staffing costs reflect about 85% of the entire election budget each year. Staffing for elections isn't cheap, and as shown on this slide, the city's code of ordinance indicates that Minneapolis has committed to compensating its election judges at a rate of at least 40% greater than the prevailing wage. Given the enactment of the $15 minimum wage, this has had a fairly significant impact on our operating budget. This slide includes a chart that compares compensation rates for election judges in 2016 and 2018 and what we forecast for 2020. As you can see, there is a difference of more than $300,000 in the staffing costs between 2016 and 2020. The other major cost factor is absentee balloting. Again, that's inclusive of vote by mail, early in person, and some other methods, all of which are focused on casting the ballot before Election Day. First, of course, I have to state that the city has no choice except to offer absentee balloting. It is required uniformly in every election across the state as provided under Minnesota statutes, Chapter 203B. At a minimum, the city would be responsible for administering vote by mail and early in-person voting, as well as healthcare facility absentee balloting and military and overseas absentee balloting. Given these legal requirements, the pie chart that's shown on this slide shows the costs associated with each method. As it's projected for 2020, you can see that vote by mail and early in-person are roughly equal in terms of their costs. Where early in-person voting requires more staff than vote by mail, the vote by mail program actually incurs more supplies, paper, postage, and also people, the 3 Ps of vote by mail absentee balloting. The multiple forms, the secrecy envelopes, the prepaid postage, and the workers who process the mail ballots adds up to being about equal to the costs of staffing and operating the city's early vote center to offer early in-person voting. The only real discretionary costs that are added to this budget are those that are tied to the multiple early vote centers shown in green on the slide. The city is not obligated to provide more than one location for early in-person voting. That Minneapolis has led the state in providing satellite voting sites, a move that's now copied in other large jurisdictions, is a testament, I think, to the support policymakers have made to expanding ballot access and increasing voter convenience. Still, those costs for those multiple sites is small in comparison to the service that's provided to voters. That's based on actual turnout data over the past 2 election cycles when we have operated multiple satellite sites only during the final 7 days of direct balloting in the general election. By limiting the time frame of when those sites are operated, we reduce the fiscal impact but still increase access and enhance opportunities for voters across the city. In 2018, 48% of all of the early in-person absentee ballots were cast during that last 7-day direct balloting period, which was almost equal to the entire number of ballots cast during the entire 46-day absentee period. In 46 days, the city collected a total of just over 6,000 absentee ballots. In the final 7-day direct balloting period, we collected more than 5,800 ballots. In fact, just 422 ballots less than that entire 46-day period. So voters clearly are coming to the poll most in those last 7 days. This slide just reiterates that point by showing the increasing impact of absentee balloting for all elections between 2012's presidential election and the 2018 gubernatorial election, What's interesting here is that there is an overall pattern showing a clear preference for early in-person voting as the preferred methodology. So although mail does have a big impact, I think that the in-person option of voting early, receiving or accessing assistance from election judges, and having multiple sites from which to choose scattered across the community is the model that seems to appeal most to Minneapolis voters. The plans that we've developed for 2020's presidential election would include a total of 3 additional early voting sites located throughout the community, in addition to our primary location we are required by law to operate at our EVS headquarters. These added sites would only be operated during the 7-day direct balloting period, which helps to reduce the budgetary impact. That completes my presentation, Mr. Chair. The staff report presented today is already included in LIMS for public access. We'll add the PowerPoint once this meeting adjourns, and I'm happy to stand for questions the committee may have.
Thank you for the presentation. I will see if my colleagues have any questions regarding the presentation. Councilmember Gordon.
I just have 2 relatively small questions. One was on the last slide. We had I was curious, maybe you said this and I missed it. What is the other? It's clear what vote by mail and in person is. What's other?
Councilmember Gordon, other includes the work we do for healthcare facility voting, where teams of election judges go to designated healthcare facilities during a designated period of absentee balloting to take the ballot to those who cannot get to the polls on election day and are in hospitals, healthcare facilities, nursing homes. It also includes military and overseas balloting, so those who are overseas or active duty military who have the right to vote, we send their ballots to them and receive those back. So other is a broader category. It also includes agent delivery, where an agent could bring back a ballot for a voter. So it's an other category that doesn't have near the engagement level, but those are all still recognized by law as valid means of voters casting their ballots.
Sure, and some of them are a little bit by mail and some of them are a little bit in person, but not the kind that we just think of usually. Then I had another question. This had to do with the presidential primary and the core messages you talked about and the issue about information. So I just want to be clear that the way we treat the information for the presidential primary is different than the way information is treated at the general election primary. Mm-hmm. And the part is when you vote in the general election primary, it's public information that you voted in that primary, but nobody knows which party you voted for. But in the presidential primary, not only will they be able to see that you voted, this is like on the Secretary of State's voter registration history, they'll be able to see which party you voted for, but certainly not which candidates.
Mr. Chair, to correct that, Councilmember
Thank you.
Gordon, no. The Secretary of State's website, our website, the city will not release which ballot was selected or how a voter voted. That still remains private data. The difficulty with the challenge with the presidential primary is that because it's a partisan contest, we have to record which ballot was selected. Voters have to sign a statement saying they agree to that party's principles, and that data will be shared with the major political parties only. So the political parties could release that data, but the state, the city, the counties, we will not be releasing that data.
Right, I understood that. So I guess I said that wrong. Although I think that when you look on the voter rolls from the Secretary of State, you can see if you voted in the primary of that governor's race in the history, but you won't know what party you voted for. Correct. And that will stay consistent. People will see, oh, they voted in the presidential primary, but the parties will know. And in the general primary, the parties don't know who voted in their primary, or do they?
Mr. Chair, the difference here is only related to the presidential. So everything else you said about the regular statewide primary is correct, and everything you identified as what would the experience be for a voter if they were to look up that they participated in the presidential primary is true as well.
Okay, so when I go vote for governor in a primary, the party doesn't find out I voted for in their primary.
That's correct.
But they will for president. Why did the state legislature make that change? Do we know?
Mr. Chair, the federal level DNC, or the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee, require that data. They would not allow Minnesota to become a presidential primary state unless we gave them access to that data. So that was a condition of allowing Minnesota to move to a presidential primary, that the parties would have access to the data.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully that added more clarity than confusion with my strange questions.
No, thank you for the question. Are there any other questions? Not seeing any of the questions, I will move to receive and file this report. Thank you, Mr. Carl. All those in favor say aye. Aye. And with that, the report is received and filed. Thank you. And with no further business, we are adjourned.